may have the courage to look up.
We've had triumphs, made some mistakes.
I'm just a bill, yes, I'm only a bill, and I'm sitting here on Capitol Hill.
House will be in order.
The purpose of my bill is to not
The bill that we had to pass.
Every year, thousands of bills are introduced in the United States Congress.
Vote no on the Clinton resolution.
Vote yes on this
Vote
resolution.
no on the request of the
Take a
president.
step forward and vote yes.
Each one is an attempt to establish a rule of law governing some aspect of our lives.
Dwindling natural resources,
Is an issue of
urban
grave
poverty,
importance.
The
malnutrition.
bills deal with an enormous variety of issues.
They come from a myriad of sources. They come from a little old lady in Pasadena, literally. Somebody will write in to a member's office and say, I have this idea for a bill. They come from good incidents that happen and terrible incidents that happen. They come from lobbyists from major corporations. They come from lobbyists from small interest groups.
House will be
The
in
bill
order.
passed the Senate yesterday to ban Timothy McVeigh, who's just been convicted and sentenced to death in the Oklahoma City bombing, from being buried in a national military cemetery. That came from somebody in Oklahoma City when they found out that he might qualify. Almost all legislators offer bills to comply with what I refer to as the first rule of politics, and that's get reelected. So members offer bills, or what we call introduced bills, based on what's going to help them back home and issues that their constituents are interested in.
The purpose of my bill is to not...
The reason so few bills become law is because there are 435 members of Congress who can all introduce bills. And if you have a Democrat and a Republican introduce a bill on the same subject matter, the majority bill, in this case the Republicans have control of the House of Representatives, the Republican bill is going to move as opposed to the Democrat bill. Similarly, there are several different versions of bills which will be introduced by different members.
And we, the undersigned senators, and
Depending on how complicated the bill is, there can be a myriad of obstacles in the way. One of them frequently is money. Whose ox is getting gored? There are coalitions that come together. There are problems with people that have very strongly held beliefs on whether it's a good idea or a bad idea. And there are a whole series of steps that you have to go through. You have to go through the introduction of the bill. You have to get it referred to the proper committee.
The question is on reporting the bill to the full committee. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
The ayes have it.
It has to be referred to the proper subcommittee. The subcommittee chairman has to believe that it's the right idea. You have to have the subcommittee chairman agree to go to hearings.
In my opinion, there are 7 major reasons for approval of the legislation before us.
You have to have the subcommittee chairman agree to go to markup. You have to have the full committee chairman agree that it's an appropriate time to go forward to markup.
The amendment is defeated.
And of course, frequently the bill has changed its character during this process. It then has to go from the full committee, get voted out, go to the House floor, through the Rules Committee process. The House has to pass it.
the yeas are 405, the nays are 2. The bill is passed.
Meanwhile, you've got a parallel procedure going on in what they call around here the other body, which is the Senate, subcommittee, full committee, floor. And then when the Senate passes one version and the House passes another version, then we have a conference committee. And the conference committee gets together, and we had to work out some kind of compromise. Then the conference committee agreement has to go back to both houses and be passed. It then has to go to the President of the United States, who has 4 options. The President can sign the bill and it becomes law. The President can veto the bill and send it back to the Congress for their further action. Congress has the option to try to override a veto, which is a 2/3 vote, very hard to do. The President can do nothing. And if the President does nothing, after 10 days, the bill will become law.
He signed your bill, now you're a law. Oh, yes!
There are somewhere between 15 and 20,000 bills that are introduced every Congress, and we get 1,000 to 1,500 public laws. So it's a tough road to hoe, and you've got to do your homework.
In 1993, the assault weapons ban was introduced in the House. It banned 19 kinds of assault weapons and banned the making or importing of ammunition clips holding more than 10 rounds. While the assault weapons ban was not a complicated piece of legislation, its journey through Congress became an emotional battle of wills. The people of the nation had strong feelings about both sides of the gun control question. Media coverage of the bill, as well as evening news reports of gun-related murder and mayhem, kept the issue at the forefront of the country's awareness. And the President of the United States made gun control one of the most important items on his agenda. These factors, along with powerful interest groups on both sides of the issue, influenced the progress of the bill on its fiercely contested path to becoming a law.
Well, first of all, it was legislation that we opposed from the start, and we opposed at the finish. It was legislation that severely curtailed our members' rights, the United States citizens' rights, to own and use the firearm of their choice.
This is so important to us because the NRA has been very successful at getting out phone calls and votes and from their members, and that's what we need to do as well. We did a constant barrage of action alerts to our members, mailings to our members, and also our department, Federal Legislation Department, spent a lot of time lobbying our members of Congress on the Hill to make sure that they have all the information they need, that they feel comfortable with their vote, that they have the information to back it up.
These are not weapons that people use for hunting. And in fact, if you used one of these weapons for hunting, you couldn't eat the animal.
The techniques that the National Rifle Association uses to work on legislation are those of education.
2 guns. Guns that are absolutely identical in terms of
we talk with lawmakers, we talk with their staff, we talk with other groups that are interested in that legislation to try to resolve the differences, fix the legislation so that it's appropriate to solving the problem it purports to solve. And then we work with our members who also have concerns about the legislation or support the legislation. It's an education process, as I see it.
There is really no substitute for sound firearms education.
We had 2 specific hearings devoted to the assault weapons ban, one in the House and one in the Senate. The hearing in the Senate included victims of violence committed with assault weapons, specifically an individual from California whose wife had been killed in a shooting at a law firm, and another victim of violence who was with her husband when he was gunned down while waiting in a line of traffic to get into the CIA headquarters where they both worked. And they testified to the putting a human face on the violence that is committed with these weapons.
Today we're privileged to hear from those on the front line, America's police.
And also we had many members of the law enforcement community which have been very supportive of the ban. And they testified to the fact that police that are on the streets are in increased danger from these weapons. And they are constantly being outgunned by the criminals they are after.
I think we have gotten to a point in our society where we need to do all we can to assist the police in controlling crime on the streets.
And in the House hearing, we also had members of the medical community from emergency hospitals which testified to the fact how much more damage is done to an individual shot with these weapons than they've ever seen before. When someone is hit with an assault weapon, they are much more likely to die.
We've always used the committee hearing process, again, as an educational process. We testified. There were many people who testified against the bill, including a woman from Texas whose parents had been murdered, who was very eloquent, and several people who had used these kinds of firearms, who had defended themselves and saved their lives and the lives of others.
2 doors were broken into, and there were people in the house downstairs. If I didn't have that gun, I could have been dead.
It was a very heated debate, both in the committee stage during the hearings and on the floor of the House and the Senate.
You want to add more magazines to the assault weapons so they can spray and kill even more people. Shame on you.
My wife lives alone 5 days a week in a rural area in upstate New York. She has a right to defend herself when I'm not there, son. And don't you ever forget it. Don't you ever forget it.
Well, first of all, you got to understand the passage of this bill was a strange one. It passed as a separate bill in the Senate back in 1993. It then passed as a separate standalone bill in the House. It was then incorporated into President Clinton's omnibus crime bill that included a lot of other things besides the ban on semi-automatic firearms. What happened was that when the crime bill came up, this became part of the crime bill that was to become contentious in the House.
Every 6 months or a year, there'll be another bill on this floor that will soon take away the rights of American citizens to keep and bear arms as is allowed them under the Second Amendment of the Constitution.
The right to bear arms does not mean that Al Capone, David Koresh, George Hennard, or anyone like them should be able to legally buy any weapon of mass destruction.
In August of 1994, there was a vote that would decide whether they were going to take up the Clinton crime bill at that time, and it was stopped by a procedural vote called a rule.
I make such a point of order.
The rule was brought down, which means that they could not at that point decide to look at the bill and vote further on it. Then there were 3 weeks in which there was a lot of activity, not in the legislative process, but in the public arena.
The United States public, overwhelmingly in favor of the bill, began to put pressure on their representatives. The president increased that pressure by holding a barrage of media events.
During his campaign, he had endorsed a ban on assault weapons. And he, as it came closer and closer to a vote, he made it almost part of his everyday existence.
As everyone knows, you don't need an Uzi to go deer hunting. You don't need an AK-47 to go skeet shooting. These are military weapons, weapons of war.
At every possible moment, he was pointing it out that we need to ban these assault weapons. We need to do this. I just can't overstate how important he was in getting it passed.
The president went out and did a lot of taking pictures and making speeches before cops and police officers to try to make his point that he was against crime.
President Clinton's not telling you about the crime bill should be a crime.
We ran ads with Mr. Heston pointing out most of the ludicrous features of the crime bill, from teaching prisoners ballet dancing to the ludicrous number of 100,000 cops on the street, to midnight basketball leagues for kids who were violent criminals, and in an effort to stop the bill. The bill was then had some revisions made to it in a sort of conference process, but it was not what would be known in the legislative arena as a true conference. It was sort of a discussion among the White House staff.
You know me, I believe in miracles. I believe that we might still get this worked out.
And was then voted on 3 weeks later and passed in the U.S. House.
The yeas are 216, the nays are 214, and the bill is passed.
And then moved to the Senate, where there was a filibuster run against it.
The president's bill costs much too much, and it must be chopped.
They got enough votes to pass it over the filibuster.
On this vote, the yeas are 61, the nays are 39.
And it was then sent to the president.
We have today a new mandate.
For the first time in 4 decades, Republicans have control of both the House and the Senate.
In 1994, Republicans won a majority in both houses of Congress. One of the effects of the power shift was that the Republican Party now took control of the management of legislation.
Gun control incorporates the worst of both worlds. Gun control.
In 1996, they introduced a bill that would repeal the ban on assault weapons. The adversaries had to start all over again.
So I don't agree that we should repeal either the assault weapons ban or the Brady bill.
Tell the NRA that their nightmare is true. We're back.
Well, we did what I call education. We talked to all our friends in the Congress, and as a result of the change in the 1994 elections, where the Republicans took control of the House after 40 years, there was a different leadership structure, there was a different committee structure, so we worked with our friends and allies in the House, on the committees, to get it brought to the floor for a vote.
And no member of this body, Republican or Democrat, should belly up to the bar, should have to be defensive about standing up for protecting all of our citizens and for standing up to our Constitution. Support this bill.
Even though the actual vote came up with very short notice, they had been threatening to do it for a long time. So the actual vote, I think, had more political significance than any legislative significance.
It was passed in the House in March of 1996. And at that point, as everybody well knows, that was a presidential year.
I will not let that be repealed.
When it passed, the next normal step was to get it to the Senate. However, at that point in time, Senator Dole was the majority leader and also on his way to being the Republican nominee. And when asked about it, he said that the repeal was not, how did he put it exactly? Was not a priority for him, because he had read the polls. He knew that the American people did not want to repeal this, and he knew, I think, also that he probably didn't have the votes in the Senate to pass it. And even if he had, the president was 100% certain to veto it. And he just didn't want to give that issue to the president.
It was not until May or so when he left the Senate, and then there was a new majority leader, and there were a lot of other issues that were facing the U.S. Senate, and they chose not to bring it up.
The way we allow campaigns in America to be financed today is nothing short of legalized graft and corruption.
The cynicism and the alienation of the average American citizen about their government is at an all-time high. And it's because they believe, and correctly so, that special interests have bought access and influence.
The financial excesses of recent political campaigns have caught the attention of the public and caused a demand for a change. In response, Republican Senator John McCain and Democrat Russell Feingold introduced a campaign finance reform bill in the Senate.
This bill imposed voluntary spending limits on candidates for Congress, in return for which there were incentives. If you agreed to abide by limits in spending, the formula set for each state, you as a candidate would get some free television time, reduced cost time otherwise, and other advantages that would accrue to you. At the same time, the McCain-Feingold bill abolished so-called soft money, which could be raised in unlimited amounts for party-building activities. The original bill wiped out political action committees as well, and did a series of other things.
Both the McCain-Feingold bill and the parallel bill introduced in the House underwent tortuous paths through Congress.
The McCain-Feingold campaign finance bill was assigned to the Senate Rules Committee, which has jurisdiction over campaign finance issues.
I oppose the McCain-Feingold campaign finance reform bill because it's a violation of the First Amendment to the United States Constitution and seeks to put the federal government in charge of the political speech of individuals, groups, candidates, and parties.
The Republicans on the committee who opposed the bill were in the majority.
The McCain-Feingold bill, of course, is what Democrats in the Senate overwhelmingly are favoring.
Democrats and any Republicans who supported campaign finance reform were in the minority and didn't have the votes to get the bill out of committee. Consequently, Senators McCain and Feingold chose to circumvent the committee process by bringing the issue directly to the Senate floor as an amendment to an unrelated bill, and forced the majority leader at the time to give us a concession to bring the bill up freestanding and going around the committee process.
The McCain-Feingold bill had support from most Democrats, a handful of Republicans. It was the only bill that had bipartisan support, had the strong backing of President Clinton, but clearly wasn't going to pass. And a filibuster in the Senate, led by Senator Mitch McConnell, killed it in the 104th Congress.
And we look forward to defeating this measure at any time it may be offered to the Senate.
Since the bill had not been voted down, the proponents of the measure had the option to revise it and submit it again. The new McCain-Feingold bill was scaled down. Instead of sweeping large changes, it focused on targeted incremental reform.
Now, nothing had happened by the late fall of 1997, but there was clearly enough turmoil to leave some hope, at least, that a reform package, probably a more modest one, would be able to move forward.
It's patently clear that the present system of laws regarding campaign financing for federal office in this country, that these laws are charade. They don't work, they're not enforced, they don't properly disclose what's really going on.
Late in the year, the Senate Governmental Affairs Committee under Fred Thompson, which was conducting hearings on allegations of scandal in campaign finance, held hearings on reform, and then managed, by threatening to block all other pieces of legislation, to get debate on their bill, the McCain-Feingold bill.
I strongly believe that political campaigns should be about people and not money.
But the modified McCain-Feingold proposal still continues to suppress the rights of Americans to communicate their ideas and to express their views.
And there was an amendment offered by Republican leaders on labor, which was designed basically to try and kill action on campaign finance reform.
I support the majority leader's decision to offer the Paycheck Protection Act as an amendment to the McCain-Feingold bill.
One of the ways to kill a bill is to attach an amendment so distasteful that it would force the bill's backers to vote against it. Such an amendment is called a poison pill.
But in America, you should have a right to say how your monies are used. And you should have the ability to express your position on an issue or on a candidate. So
Senator Lott denied that his amendment was a poison pill amendment. But there's little question that what Senator Lott wanted to do, with an amendment that would in effect dramatically reduce labor, organized labor's chances of having impact on campaigns, was to come up with something that Democrats simply could not support. If all had gone the way that Senator Lott hoped, that his amendment would have passed, and then Democrats, instead of pushing their bill forward, would have been forced into a position of opposing the campaign finance reform bill and would have lost some of their moral high ground on the issue. That's why the amendment was called a poison pill.
I cannot align myself, even though I agree with the underlying intent, with an effort that has no chance of success in terms of passing any legislation or passing an amendment, but that would in effect make sure that the underlying bill, McCain-Feingold, and the so-called Lott Amendment both, make sure that they would both never become the law of this land.
The Speaker of the House and the Majority Leader of the Senate hold great power over the fate of legislation.
The Senate Majority Leader was hostile, basically, to changing the campaign system.
until we do something about the paycheck equity issue and allowing people to have some say over how their dues are used, to have voluntary contributions to campaigns, I don't see how we can ever resolve this issue.
Now, frankly, to be fair, there were an awful lot of Democrats who strongly supported the reform plan up on the floor because they knew that Senator Lott would kill it. This is not simply an issue where most members of one party are really for change and most members of the other are not. But no question, the preponderance of Democrats would like to see campaign reform, and the preponderance of Republicans wouldn't, some of that being a reflection of the fact that Democrats are in the minority right now, and the majority party naturally tends to do better under the status quo system.
A debate in the Senate, by its very nature, allows senators to offer amendments, to exchange views with regard to the language of the bill itself. But we've been precluded from doing that. Why? Because the majority has disallowed the opportunity for anybody to offer an amendment. What kind of a debate is that?
We had some extensive debate, and basically the bill was filibustered. We then had some cloture votes.
Under the previous order, the clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
You need 60 votes in the Senate to invoke cloture, which is another way of saying that you're going to end debate, which would allow you to move a bill forward and pass it.
On this vote, the yeas are 53, the nays 47. The motion is not agreed to.
Unfortunately, though, we still were not able to break the filibuster and get cloture, and therefore the bill was not able to pass.
In essence, what we're doing here is pulling the bill. We're now stating that, at least for purposes of this week, perhaps this session of Congress, debate on the campaign finance reform bill is over. We're not prepared to accept that.
Those two cloture votes that we just took, in my opinion, put an end to the campaign finance reform at this time.
The best lobbyists in Washington, the strongest special interests, know how the system works. They are experts at it. That's how they get what they want, constantly. If you change the system on them, they are at a disadvantage. They can't get their way. It puts more power, in essence, to the people. But because of that threat to their existence and the way of life that as they know it, they worked very diligently to defeat any efforts that we were making to change the system.
If the American people demand change, they'll get it. That's the nature of our democracy and the way our government functions. But if they don't demand it and tell their elected representatives that it's a high priority, then we're going to have a system that further and further alienates the American voter from their elected representative. And I think that's very dangerous for the future of the country.
I'm just a bill, yes, I'm only a bill, and I'm sitting here on Capitol Hill.
The purpose of my bill is an issue of grave importance.
Honestly hope our bill can do.
Get the government.
When members draft bills, they're frequently drafted quickly in the heat of the moment, and without the true thought that is necessary from people on both sides of the issue. So by having this incredibly detailed process that one has to go through, you're able to hear from all sides of the issue.
She has a right to defend herself. Shame on you.
What kind of a debate is that?
Now, people have quoted Bismarck for years, that the law is like a sausage. It's a good product to use, but don't watch how they make it. I don't agree with that. I think it's a good product to use, and it is the people who are represented here. So this long, laborious process is a way that we actually carefully examine that which we are going to place upon the people, and those are the responsibilities of upholding and obeying the American law.
Thank you.